Welcome to the Faith is Not Blind podcast. I'm Sarah Devonier, and I am really happy to be here with my son Holden. He is our oldest. We have 7 kids, and he recently returned home from his mission in the Côte d'Ivoire in the Ivory Coast in Africa. And not only did he return from his mission during the pandemic, his mission itself was, I think, a learning experience for all of us. It really tested our faith and helped us decide what was important to us. And so I'm pleased that he's willing to share some of his experiences with us. So welcome, Holden.
Thank you.
I was thinking about Holden Caulfield when we were preparing for this interview. And as you know, one of the reasons that we gave you that name is because we hoped that you would be a catcher in the rye. And I don't know that a lot of people know what that means if they haven't read the book. But let me just ask you to start off, what does that mean to you to sort of be a catcher in the rye, to be like your namesake?
Well, Catcher in the Rye is one of my favorite books.
It had to be.
Right, naturally. I had always looked forward all my life to reading it because I knew that's where my name came from. To say what it means, I first want to say that I love that it comes from a story. Since both of my parents obviously are English professors, my life was a literary one. And so seeing Holden Caulfield and then what it means to be a catcher in the rye, it's not just simply saving people. It is, for Holden, especially throughout the story, it is trying to grapple with the loss of innocence, which I think was a definite theme in my mission, but it's being able to catch them, to cradle them, to love them. It's these people that don't know they're in a field and that they fall off, and all you want to do is just catch them and cradle them. And so Holden's goal is to save them. But what's so beautiful about the story is that he himself is saved, not necessarily because he's caught away from innocence, but he learns to accept what it means to move past it, which is why the scene at the end of the book, when he sees his sister Finb on the carousel, is so important. Is to catch someone means is that you're ready to be there, but you need to let them make that jump.
Yeah, well, that progression, and I hope we can call it that progression from innocence to experience, and then the deliberate choice to stay open to love, to stay open to helping people despite the loss of innocence, is one that I'd like to talk about with your personal story. You talked about loving stories. Let's talk about your story that I think in some nice ways mirrors Holden's story. In that stage of innocence before your mission to the Ivory Coast, what was your faith like? How would you describe why you wanted to serve a mission? Because I know as your mom, you wanted to serve people, you wanted to teach them about the gospel. What was it like before you got there?
Before I got to the point where I wanted to serve, or?
Yeah, before you got to so why did you want to serve a mission? So before you got to Africa.
Well, I just throughout my life, the gospel was really an important part of our home growing up, but also questions were really important. So just understanding, and I felt like as I grew older, I began asking more and more questions. I was in debate, I liked studying philosophical questions, and I felt like the gospel responded to those, not necessarily because it completed a formula, but it like in terms of a story, it had a theme. It gave a theme, it gave it a premise, it gave it a reason to exist and beauty to that story. And one of the most fundamental parts of my life was an experience where I was having a really tough time in high school. I was trying to be a better person. I was trying to do what I needed to do. And I was teaching the priest quorum about Moses 7, which is my favorite chapter, which is where Enoch sees God weeping over the children of men. And all God says is, how can I not weep for those that are of my blood, that now hate their own blood, that they're related to me? And when I thought about the fact that everything that happens in the world doesn't necessarily happen for a reason, that God doesn't necessarily ordain every little thing, but he actively weeps. That someone who is so majestic, someone who is so perfect, actively chooses to suffer, overwhelmed me. And I came home that day and I knelt down just to say thank you, that he was willing to cry over my mistakes, that he let me hurt myself. And before I even started that prayer, I started bawling, because very distinctly it felt like there was a person kneeling next to me, and they draped my arm around me and was crying with me. That was probably the most fundamental moment of my life, because it wasn't like everything will be okay. That wasn't what it said. It said, I am crying with you because I know what it's like. And that is what I want other people to feel. And one of my favorite novels in the Brothers Karamazov answers that question too, when a monk is asked, how can all this suffering happen? He responds, I don't know, but there was one person that suffered with all of them. And so it's not meaningless. And so like a story there, no matter all of the despair, it has meaning. And I wanted to go on a mission to be able to help people see a premise, to see meaning to their lives, that they're not alone. They don't need to know the end of the story or even that it'll work out, but to know that someone's reading it.
Yeah. What a beautiful experience to have. And at such a young age, when we talk about the journey from innocence to experience, to be able to feel that closeness to God, but maybe it hadn't had the chance to be tested yet. So going into your mission with that, what a great root system to have, to feel like God was close to you and he cared about you. But in some ways, going on your mission was a little bit like leaving Eden. Not that our home was in Eden, but just that closeness to God, and that almost nothing could separate you from the love of God in that moment. Will you share a little bit about what it felt like to get to the mission field in Africa in your first area? Did that challenge this perception of God always being there, or did you have questions about it? How did that move your personal narrative forward to the next chapter?
Well, like I said, a lot of my testimony was built on this idea of shared suffering. But the problem is that my conception of suffering was very small, and my faith was not tempered. It was, rationally it made sense, and I loved it, but it didn't. It was just ore that needed to be refined. Before I talk about my first area, I want to mention that a lot of the way I was able to deal with my first area was because of the MTC.
Okay, yeah.
And I was in Ghana in the MTC with 2 other companions, and I think it was our second week we were threatened to be sent home on 3 separate occasions because of just all of the disagreements that were going on. I had a companion that pulled the fire alarm for no apparent reason, another one that made a girl cry. It was I'd never experienced anything like it. But what was interesting is that what I realized though is that the way that I conceived of things and the way they conceived of things were different, but we had the same goal. And that we somehow needed to find a way to work together to move it forward, even though it was difficult.
Yeah, so culturally, so there were 3 companionships together. Each one of them came from a different culture.
Right.
And so you seeing the differences in the culture, how did that help enhance your understanding? Because like you said, you almost got sent home, but it clearly was for kind of cultural reasons. They're just different people responding to this MTC experience, that even though you were in the same MTC, it was so different for the 3 of you. How did that teach you to see the different cultural experiences that the 3 of you were having?
Well, it helped when I learned their stories, like why they came and what it took, because I realized that while maybe for them being on time to a certain lesson wasn't as important than like for me, where I thought punctuality was really important, but for them, they literally sacrificed their ability to have good jobs. They sacrificed their reputations to the point where they were so afraid of going home because they knew what waited them, but they knew they needed to go. They sacrificed so much more than I ever could to come. And so when I started realizing that yeah, maybe the minutia didn't matter, but ultimately our devotion to God is what mattered. And when I saw their yearnings and desires, that's when it started clicking for me. And then it wasn't didn't get easier necessarily, but I was willing to kind of take a step back and realize that I could be causing the problem too. And that if I learned where they were coming from, if I learned their stories, I would learn to love them, and that's all that really mattered.
So you weren't sort of imposing your story on them anymore, or this sort of, could we even say a platonic idea of suffering sort of became real because you saw it in them.
Yeah. I was able to give up the mantle of protagonist, I could say.
Oh, wow.
And I think that helped me, is that I actually saw what it took to suffer, and I saw what actual devotion looked like. And so that really helped, especially when I went into the mission field, is I was cut off from, I didn't talk to my family for about a month. I didn't have really running water. Electricity was hard to come by. We were using rainwater to do pretty much to do most things. Everybody knew me as the white guy because most people hadn't seen a white person before. And it was so different. It was so crazy. And it was so difficult because I was there for a purpose, and I was miserable. And I was like, how could I be miserable? I'm supposed to be on my mission. I had faith. I did all these right things, but it was just hard. The language was not the same language I had learned at the university. The people believed in different things, and I yearned to talk to them. I yearned to understand what was happening, but there were so many barriers. I was just frustrated.
Yeah. And this idea of suffering, it's just so interesting to think. You knew in abstract God was there weeping with you when you were a teenager and praying, and you knew that God was willing to suffer with you, but it sounds like it was the first time you had actually suffered. So
Yeah.
how, in a real way with depth. So how did you apply those lessons you had learned in abstract, and also through observing your MTC companions? How did you apply that so that the lessons you could learn became a part of your story and not just something you knew about in your head?
I think what I had to learn to do is that when I wanted to help people, because I told myself that there was a particular moment in my training when I was like, I thought if I could go home right now, no strings attached, no judgments, no one would ever talk about it again, and I could leave, would I go right now? And I said, how could I do that and tell all these people that I am essentially saying that I am better than them, and I don't want anything to do with their lives? How could I say that? And what I had to realize is that even though there were moments when I didn't feel the Spirit, when I was just trudging through the jungle, when I was rained on, or all of those different things, even if I didn't feel anything, I had to know that I was there for them. And that just like when I don't feel God is there, I still know He's there. And I have to act as if I know He's there. And that's what pushed me through, is I had to just think, regardless of how I feel like things are, I just need to know that as long as I make myself present and make myself known, I can help. And that I just had to keep pushing.
Yeah. And what a difficult lesson to learn. And I think, again, how you said earlier, I had to make other people the protagonist too. It wasn't just about me. And sometimes when people are the protagonist of their story, sometimes leaving their mission might be the right thing to do. But for you and your story,
Right.
the right thing to do was to realize you needed to stay for those people. Mm-hmm. What did this teach you about the sanctifying power of suffering? How did it change your ability to see what is sanctified, what is holy?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that was a definite theme throughout my mission, is because I thought that my mission would be this really easy, holy experience, and that I would just ride through euphoria. It would be fantastic. But then it was hard. It was like the Mosaic Law version of sanctification. We had to sacrifice goats literally actually. But when you think about the Mosaic Law, you literally have to get in the blood and guts and bone of animals. You have to kill something, but it's still holy because it turns you to the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate suffering. And I remember that time after time when I had companions that were difficult to deal with, or situations that I didn't like, I had to take a step back and just and listen to them and try to join in their suffering. I had companions that had to work in mines as children, that were multiple companions that were disowned, refugees from ethnic disputes. And I just had, what I realized is that it's when you embrace the suffering and you acknowledge it for what it is, but you don't let it corrupt you. That's what holiness is. That's why Jesus came down, is so that he could take on the world. And so if I took on other people's stories and I loved it because it's their story, not mine, that is when I started seeing what's holy and what love is. All the other little things faded away because it was just them. And just like for me, when I felt a holy presence next to me, that's all that mattered. That was what is important, is our bond and that love. And that's why Jesus was the message I wanted to share, is because he made every individual story important, and it mattered because he suffered with them and he joined himself to those stories.
Yeah. How did sharing that message help people even when you couldn't change their circumstances, when they were living in difficulty, more difficult than I could ever imagine? How did sharing the message that you talked about of the Savior help transform that very real, sometimes very violent type of life into something holy for them?
Well, I can remember many times when I talked with people, and there's one sister that comes to mind where she was just crying, and she said, "I don't know how I can do this anymore." And I remember looking at like the true despair and not knowing what to do because I had never experienced it before. And I shared the story of the God who weeps, but I didn't know if it worked. I couldn't change her situation. But we were always there for her. And I think what I realized is that by sharing this story and by helping people understand that they're not alone, that at the very least that they can have a purpose, that all this suffering can help them become stronger, or at the very least they know that they're not alone and that someday it'll work out. And I'd say that I love the Ivorian people, not because necessarily that they were happy in bad situations, but because they lived. They were ferocious, just like the jungle. They had sufferings, they had problems. Yes, they were poor, but they lived their lives and they loved it. And so bringing the gospel is just a way of saying, you matter. Because that was the big thing, being in a place that used to be a colony, is just this feeling that nothing is in their control. But the one thing that the gospel could help them have is realize that they're not alone, that their lives matter, their suffering can mean something, and that whether they can't control their circumstances, they can have a relationship. And like I said, that's the only thing that matters, and that's the only thing we can control.
Yeah, that it's so sweet to imagine that the same God who would weep with a 16-year-old kid in Idaho is the same kid that would weep with a woman in Africa who's struggling with the possibility, like this woman was, of losing her children, of not being able to see her children, of being left by her husband, that the same God sheds tears for both of those people, for this suffering, whatever form it takes. So now you're home from your mission. You came home from your mission in the middle of a pandemic. How would you describe your relationship with God now? You're not being compelled to suffer in the same way that you were in the middle of the jungle, not being able to communicate with your family. But what is it like now, and how do you make sure that you're nurturing that relationship, even maybe when the suffering might be a little bit different?
Well, I think about my mission a lot, and I think about the jungle and the people that I loved. And what I do now is I have to remember that, like I said, what matters is the relationship. That Jesus suffered for everyone, and that the way that I understood what holiness was by listening to others people's stories and making it important. And so since I've come home, I've tried to appreciate what other people's stories mean, and I try to understand what I need to do to build that relationship. Maybe I'm not suffering in the same way, but I still need to be aware of what's going on, especially when when I don't necessarily feel the same way all the time. I need to make sure that I am that I'm still acting as if I'm still in that same situation, if that makes sense. Like I'm still actively engaged in suffering with other people, that I always need to remind myself there's a story I don't know, and that by doing that, I am in the communion of that suffering. And I love Paul's phrase there, that we just enter in communion with other people, and that whatever suffering it is, it's theirs. And so by linking ourselves together, that's how.
Yeah, the kinship of his suffering, which is such a beautiful phrase, and it combines so well with mourning with those that mourn and comforting those that stand in need of comfort, whatever that looks like. If there are people listening to this podcast who are either preparing for missions or trying to reconcile with their mission experience, what would you tell them is the best way to find communion with God when maybe they're feeling a little far from Him?
I remember many times in my mission where I felt far. My mission introduced a darkness into my life that I hadn't felt before, and that's okay. I think that's what I needed to know, is the fact that to understand what heaven is, you need to understand a little bit of what it means to be far from it, which is hell. And I knew so many missionaries who felt so bad that they weren't having these experiences, that they were suffering, and I just wanted to tell them, and I did, that what you're doing is God. It is godful sorrow and mourning, but that is the most redemptive form. That is what Christ did. That is what it means to be Christ-like, is to mourn with them. And so the fact that you feel far just means that you're doing the right thing, that you care, and that you're trying and you're pushing. And if you want to go closer to God, remember that when you are with these people, just listen. That's how I kind of came to love my companions and the Ivorians, is just listening. Because everyone yearns for the same thing. They all yearn for peace and comfort and to not be alone. And so knowing it's okay that you feel alone, but also knowing that you can feel the Spirit through your relationships with other people, and that as you strive for that communion, you'll find it. God will appear to you, and you will feel that you are never alone.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing not only about that communion, but about how difficult it can be sometimes. And I like how you said, and that's okay, because we can appreciate the sanctification process as a process more when we understand how difficult sometimes it can be. So thank you so much for sharing that, Holden. Thank you for being such a good example of a catcher in the rye, and of someone who helps other people want to help other people as well as be helped. So thank you.